Hi, I'm Dr. Leslie Randall. I'm a GYN oncologist and the division director at Virginia Commonwealth University Massey Cancer Center. And I also run the clinical trial portfolio for cervical cancer for the GOG Foundation for GOG Partners. And I'm really excited to be here today with my friend John Hayes from The Ohio State University to talk about accrual culture and our GOG Partners education series that we've been recording recently. Um, Hi, John. Welcome to the recording.
Hi, Leslie. Thank you for the opportunity. Happy to be here.
Yeah, it's so great to have you here. Can you just give us a quick introduction about the many hats that you wear there at The Ohio State
Sure.
University?
I'm John Hayes. I'm a medical oncologist. My primary practice is in gynecologic oncology, where I help run a phase one clinic within our gynecologic oncology group. I'm also the medical director for the clinical trials office for the Cancer Center here at the James at The Ohio State University. And happy to be able to help and answer questions and talk about getting trials open and getting patients accrued to trials.
Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks for doing this. We've put together these educational snippets. Hopefully, the inception of this was to help our newer sites become good and our good sites become great. And, you were handpicked because you guys have done such a great job there at The Ohio State with your accrual and your studies startup timeline. So I just want to kind of pick your brain about that today. Can you tell us a little bit about how you've accomplished? Maybe first start with your accrual culture, and then we'll sort of get to the startup timelines later.
I think being at a cancer center and one of our biggest goals is really to offer our patients what is the newest and the latest and the most cutting edge treatments that we can. And I think as part of that, offering clinical trials is really kind of the bread and butter of what we want to do. When I came here, there was a wonderful program that was already established, and Dr. Cohn and Dr. O'Malley, and Dr. Fowler and Dr. Copeland, and all of them really had pushed clinical trials for a long period of time.
Yeah.
And what we try to think about is when we have a patient coming in for treatment is not what is the first standard of care we can do, but what can we offer as far as a clinical trial as a choice for that patient. I think it's, we can offer something that many places cannot, and having a choice of trials for patients at almost any stage of their disease process. And I think from an enrollment standpoint, that's a huge advantage and bonus and for our patients. And what we try to do is keep our trial list up to date and not overlapping per se. And Dr. O'Malley, who's been wonderful at spearheading this within the gynecologic oncology group here, has put together flow sheets not only by disease but also by stages for patients, so that if a patient comes in and has ovarian cancer and is platinum resistant, we have a flow sheet saying, here are the two trials that are currently available for frontline platinum resistant ovarian cancer. And if the patient, if she would like to do those, we get her on trial as fast as we can. And if not, we can still do standard of care. And when that patient progresses again, if that happens, then we have other trials that we can offer in the next situation. And those flow sheets help us kind of keep the trials at the front of our own mindset when we see our patients, because sometimes it's a little harder to think about trials when we're seeing a patient. You've got a busy clinic and you're just trying to keep up, and having something in front of you to remind you what's available can really help in our accrual.
That's great. That's great. And I have to correct you. I think usually you guys have more like 5 trials available
we
for
try not to have too
platinum
much
resistant
overlap,
ovary, not two.
but I think it's important. You don't want to have too many things in the same queue. But I think every institution has areas where they have a lot of patients, and we happen to have a whole lot of patients with ovary and endometrial cancers, and so we can have more trials in the queue and still have the ability to put patients on those trials. And I think that's really important for investigators to be honest with themselves and say, what is our area where we see a lot of patients that we can put a lot of patients on trials? And it may be that in one area, in say recurrent cervix, you may not have as many patients, and so it may behoove you to have one trial open that you can definitely get patients on. But in recurrent ovary, you may have many patients, and so you can have 2, 3, 4, 5 trials open.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to, maximize your accrual, really understanding where you have overlaps and non-overlapping entry criteria, cues where you can have multiple trials open and cues where you can't. And platinum resistance, certainly one of those. And Dr. O'Malley, as you mentioned, he's led that charge for us as the GOG partners.
Mm-hmm.
And, for me, with my hat with cervix, like we're actually getting to a point where we have multiple cervix trials, which has never happened. And now that we've got immune therapy and non-immune therapy, with checkpoint exposed and non-exposed patients, we're going to start to have this menu of options with the non-overlapping criteria. So that's a great point to maximize accrual that, when you're opening trials, to really pay attention to that. I think from a culture perspective, I'm curious what your thoughts are. Trying to build a culture in a new program, some things that I come up against are, it's just kind of easier to do standard of care therapy, or, why would I put a patient on an experimental or an investigational therapy when I've got, a tried and true standard of care regimen that I know how to manage? Like, why would I offer them something that I don't know what the outcome is? What do you say to that?
I think that's a great question, and I think it's always something that comes up, because I think the default for many of us is, oh well, I've got standard of care options, and I've been giving carbotaxol, or I've been giving weekly Taxol for years. I can manage this easily. But I think one of our big goals is we owe to our patients the ability to really be involved in the development of what is the next weekly Taxol, what is the next Avastin. And if we don't offer that to our patients as a field, we're never going to move forward. And I think that's really important. And it does take more time and effort. And believe me, I've spent my life wanting to run and be involved with clinical trials, and I could probably double my clinic volumes if I weren't doing clinical trials. However, I think it's really important that our patients have those choices, and not every patient is going to choose them, and that's okay. I don't think, some patients may say, I don't ever really want to do trials, and I never try to force a patient to do them, but I always want to give them the option.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I went through as a physician sort of that evolution of, knowing I had something, that I knew what was going to happen. I could tell my patient what to expect. And then like doing that over and over again and realizing how grossly inadequate many of our treatments really are. And think, this is just not good enough. Like, we have got to do better. And I really, at the core of my being, believe that we've got to do better. And clinical trials are how, it happens. So I couldn't agree with you more there.
And I think there's an excitement to it. And I think as investigators, we get invested in what we're doing. And a new and a novel therapy is great and a little scary at the same time, but it's also a wonderful opportunity to move forward. And I think if we don't do this, then, we're going to stagnate. I think ovarian cancer and cervical cancer and endometrial cancer have all had great strides in the last 5 or 6 years because of these trials, and because we've been willing to push patients to not push, but get patients enrolled on trials. And as a group, the GOG has been wonderful in really pushing that forward. And without those trials in place, we'd still be where we were 10 years ago.
There is no question. And, I think, we got to recognize the patients. Like, the patients are moving the field forward. We're leading this charge as investigators and physicians, but these patients are like making this happen. To me, that is just, the ultimate. I just have so much
patients are willing to give
for
of
our
themselves
patients.
Is incredible. That's incredible.
Right.
I mean, for us, it's kind of, I don't want to say easy, but for us, it's an intellectual challenge. But for a patient to really give of themselves is a huge, huge ask. And I think we can never thank our patients enough for actually making that happen.
No question. So shout out to our patients. Hopefully some
Definitely.
prospective patients out there are watching these and trying, getting more familiar with what we're doing here, what we're trying to do with our trials. Awesome. So let's switch gears a little bit, and maybe you can talk to me about, timelines, startup timelines. Like, these can be a real barrier to being able to participate in a study, especially, if a sponsor comes and they need a trial open, or, if the standard of care is changing rapidly, like it is for many of our diseases. Like, it's in the patient's best interest for us to be able to get this trial open for them quickly. How have you guys improved your study startup timelines?
I think it's kind of been a very evolving atmosphere over the last 5 to 10 years. I think 10 years ago, we fully expected when you opened large trials, they were going to be open for a couple of years. And you didn't have to be as quick at getting a trial open and enrolling at your site to know that it would be available. But I think many of our partners in both industry as well as in cooperative groups had realized that we need to enroll trials faster so that we can get the answers that we need to move forward. And so that puts a little bit of pressure on getting trials open. I'm not sure that's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing for the field, although it makes it a little tougher on the front end for those of us opening trials. Getting a trial open is not an overnight process. It takes time. And I would venture to guess that in most academic centers, if they're doing well, it takes 3 to 3.5 months to get a trial opened. And that includes getting the protocol from the sponsor, getting the protocol through regulatory and through contracts, and also through your own IRB or clinical science review committees. And all of those steps take a little bit of time. The IRBs don't meet every day. They meet once a month. And so you have to get on a schedule. I think as a goal, we at Ohio State have a goal of trying to be around 3 to 3.5 months for most trials getting to startup. And I think that's an admirable goal. And I think we were there or pretty close to there prior to 2020. And I think 2020 threw a wrench in a lot of our plans, unfortunately. And we're still recovering from that. But I think that that's definitely a goal to shoot for going forward as we return back to normal.
Yeah, I think 3 months is really reasonable. And, some of our best sites can open a trial a month, 2 months. I think just, in terms of advice to other sites, like one of the things that really tends to speed things up is instead of doing, each step in series, IRB, contracting, getting, radiation approval for scans, getting bio specimen approval, like trying to do all that in parallel, like create a mechanism at your institution where you can do all those things at once. And as approvals come in, each individual person is informed that, XYZ committee approved this. And
I think that's a great point. I think, historically, we probably did things more in series. And one of the things we recognized 5 years ago when we realized our time to trial was getting too long was that you got to do these things in parallel. You have to do more than one thing at a time. And that obviously there are things that can't be done in parallel. We at Ohio State, we go through a scientific review that predates going to the IRB, and you have to have scientific review approval before you go to the IRB. But there's nothing that says that you can't have various committees, you can't have your budget group, and you can't have your regulatory committee working on a lot of these things in parallel with the assumption that the trial is going to make it through the scientific review and IRB settings.
That's great. That's excellent. One thing about the partner studies that's really helped us as an institution is that they often will use central IRB review and that has sort of taken the pressure off of our IRB, which has, its own institutional studies to review and makes it us a priority, and we can get that approval faster.
Central IRBs have definitely sped things up, whether through truly central IRB or Western IRB or whichever IRB of choice is taken, definitely because they meet on a more regular basis and they have a shortened timeline that you can submit and get something back. And that definitely is one way to get trials open quicker.
Yeah, thanks for letting me brainstorm here. I'm just thinking of other ways that, we can. Do you have other suggestions for how to speed up this process for the site?
I think really for most institutions, and you brought up a really good point, which is most trials require input from a lot of different groups. And so it behooves most institutions, and I think a lot of institutions have that, where within a clinical trials organization, when a protocol comes in, there's a small committee that says, okay, these are the folks that need to meet and approve this. So here's who needs to see it quickly. As opposed to a PI getting it and saying, oh, I think I need somebody from radiation to see this, or I think I need somebody from, medical oncology to see this, and trying to find the right people, but having it go through an organization that can say, okay, this is going through the Gyn-Onc group. We need a PI from the Gyn-Onc group, but we need radiation oncology involved. And to have a centralized, it doesn't have to be a big formal structure, but to have a small committee that can say, okay, we have contacts for all of these groups, so we can get it moving in a lot of directions at the same time. And I think that's really important.
That's great. What is the equivalent of that at your institution? What serves that?
So we actually have in our clinical trials organization, we have a study startup group and an implementation team. And the entire goal of the implementation team is to, shall we say, grease the wheels and get this process going much faster. And that is, okay, if this trial needs to get through radiology because it's having central review and they need to be able to ship the images out, we have contacts in radiology that they can bring on board within a day, as opposed to someone realizing that 3 weeks after getting the protocol and then emailing around in radiology to find out who they need to contact. And so our implementation team has all of that streamlined so that when we get a protocol, they can look through the entire protocol and send an email to the PI and say, here are the people we think we need to contact. Do you agree? And that process starts immediately.
We have an activation team as well. And it, like you said, it just makes it a central clearinghouse. It's well-oiled machine. And, they have an email box, you just email the activation team and somebody will help you. But, what we've been iterating their processes, and what we've learned is they work better if allotted to a certain disease group. So you have your people, as in GYN, you have your go-to people for IRB, for contracting, you have the one go-to person. And then the second thing we've learned by having that team is that, a lot of these things that go through radiation committee, they're exactly the same. They're like a CAT scan every 6 to 8 weeks for recess. So, we've been able to identify some things that are very duplicative across studies, and we're trying to come up with some master agreements within our own institution where we don't have to go through this process every single time unless it's something that's unusual. Because let's face it, most of the protocols in cancer, they're just the same thing over and over, right?
It's in many cases, it's take disease A, insert drug B, and for the most part, they're very similar templates. I think it's also important at an institution level, and probably where we see a lot of backups is within our budgeting and contracts. And I think part of that is each institution is going to have different amounts that they will have as their standard of care amounts for budgeting. And I think it's important to have templates of those already set up so that you're not recreating the wheel with every single trial that walks through. And I think templating not only the budget, but almost all of these other processes can make them much faster.
That is a great point. That is often the sort of bottleneck for a lot of our startups, is that contracting process. John, this has been great. I think we're out of time. I just want to thank you so much for joining us. I think we've, outlined a few practical solutions for our sites. We're hoping to continue this series. We have other snippets. We'd also like to continue to engage our our investigator partners moving forward. You're on our investigators council, which is excellent. So we'll be having a mechanism to better engage our investigators as a group, moving forward.
Excited to be a part of this process and happy to try to expand the GOG Partners group as much as we can to help these trials get moving faster.
Great. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for the opportunity. Good to talk to you.
Okay, Jenna, cut.